Hi, everyone. So we are talking about Chapter 5. This is Psych 92, Developmental Psychology. And we are now going to talk about cognitive development in middle and late childhood. Oops. So in terms of cognitive development, remember that we are using the framework of Piaget's cognitive development. So now we had talked about the sensory motor period when infancy and childhood. We talked about the pre-operational period. Now we are in the concrete operational stage. So 7 to 11 years old. Remember, when we talk about operations, we're talking about mental operations. So in the concrete operational stage, now kids can combine, order, transform objects and actions. So concrete operational, they still need manipulatives. They still cannot engage in abstract thinking, but those mistakes that they made in early childhood, they're no longer making them. So in this stage, there is decreased egocentrism. So remember, in early childhood, kids did not understand that people had different ideas, knowledge bases, or desires from them, right? They thought if they like Batman, everybody likes Batman. In the concrete operational stage, children now understand theory of mind. They know that other people have separate minds and brains from them. They have separate types of knowledge. So that egocentrism decreases quite a bit. Now kids tend to have better, more, they're able to organize their thoughts better. They're more flexible, both physically and cognitively, and they tend to be more predictable. So this is a really nice stage in terms of just education and school. Okay, so logical principles, remember, in the concrete operational stage now, because of this maturity, they can actually use logical principles to solve problems. They can solve problems tied to their own direct experience. So now, because their memory capacity increases a bit, they don't rely on other people to tell them as much, remember and how to remember to do things. So learning by doing is huge at this stage. Again, because their prefrontal cortex is not fully formed yet, they still have some difficulty in terms of solving hypothetical or abstract problems. And it is still challenging for them to use inductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning, remember, is when you take different premises that have to be true and you use them to come to a conclusion. So you have different clues, right? So it's really interesting. Any of you who read Sherlock Holmes, and people often say, oh, well, it's deduction. No, actually, Sherlock Holmes used induction, not deduction, but semantics, right? So what are some skills that kids can do when we're in this concrete operational stage? Classification. That is being able to look at different hierarchies and subclasses. So learning about the animal kingdom, right? Kingdom, phylum, class, genus, species, all of those components. Kids at this stage are really good at it. So this is a wonderful time to kind of introduce those ideas to them. Identity. So understanding that qualities can remain constant even despite some physical superficial changes. That's what we mean by identity. So oftentimes we're not talking about personal identity. We're talking about the identity of, for instance, that piece of clay. That's still clay. Even if you change the way it looks, change the form and everything, it's still clay. So that's the idea of identity we're talking about here. Reversibility, some things can return to the original state if changed. So we can talk about that with clay. You can change the way it looks. You can make it look like a ball, or you can make it look like a square, but it's still clay. Another idea is you can start introduce the concepts of science, right? You can show them an ice cube, have it melt in front of them, and then put it back in the freezer, and then guess what? It's ice again. So that's that idea of reversibility. You can also start introducing math concepts, right? 4 plus 2 equals 6, 6 minus 4 equals 2. So those ideas also count for reversibility. Conservation, we talked about the conservation errors that kids in early childhood make. So they don't make those mistakes anymore. And we'll review that a bit later. Decentration. So in early childhood, they had the problem of centration, where they only focused on one aspect, such as, how much space is between coins. Decentration means that now people can consider different dimensions. So when early childhood, you showed them an elephant, classify the elephant, they would say, okay, this is a mammal, and then nothing else. Now, when you're decentered, okay, this is a mammal. It's also gray. It has a trunk, so you can use different characteristics of an object to classify it, and kids now can consider these different dimensions. And then seriation. It's really just putting it along quantitative dimensions. So they can now order things from greatest to least, least to greatest, that kind of idea. Any questions about these elements of concrete operational thought? You do have to know them and be able to distinguish from all of these. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different elements that you should know well enough that you can either give examples like I did, or identify which category it is or which element it is based on a description. So here, this is just an example of that classification that kids can now do. Kingdom, file, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So that's a really prevalent classification that we often use. And so they can do this classification and also, even talk about seriation with this. Remember, conservation is that understanding that even when certain properties, when the appearance changes, the properties remain the same. So the conservation of mass, total mass remains the same despite its shape. Remember, kids were asked, does each pile have the same amount of clay? And they say, kids in early childhood, look at it, even if in front of them you spread it out and don't take anything away, they're going to say that the one that's longer has more mass. Well, in middle and late childhood, in the concrete operational stage, they no longer make that mistake and they're not fooled by the change in shape. Conservation of volume, remember, so the conservation of mass is that the amount stays the same. Conservation of volume, now we're talking about liquid. The amount of liquid remains the same even if they're poured into a different container. So remember, this was Piaget's task. Does each glass have the same amount, poured into a narrow one? And then kids, in concrete operational stage are no longer fooled when it goes into the more narrow, taller vial. And the final one is conservation of number. So number of items remains the same despite the order or organization. Again, when you spread it out this way, kids in early childhood think that the lower row has more coins because they're fooled by the amount of space that's in between. And kids in concrete operational no longer make that mistake. So classification is being able to categorize by multiple criteria. So kids in early childhood don't do very well with games like Uno, but in middle and late childhood, they can do that because now they know you can actually classify by color or by number, by suit, things like that, card games. Kids at this age are better at planning as well. Another important skill that kids in middle and late childhood develop is something known as metacognition. So when we say meta, it's kind of like an overall greater understanding. Metacognition is your ability to think about how you think. So learning strategies become really good at this stage. So I know about learning how to read. I know how and when to use strategies and which ones to use. I know and can demonstrate how to monitor my understanding. I know how to reflect on my own learning. All of these skills are part of metacognition. So prior to this developmental stage in early childhood, kids would learn things, but not really know how they're learning. It isn't until middle and late childhood that kids now have a greater understanding about their own strengths and weaknesses, right? I know what I can do when I'm not comprehending what I read. I know when I'm learning. I know when I don't comprehend what I read. So these are really important skills, and especially in school, right? Sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And that's where exams and quizzes and things like that come in, is actually to test your understanding and retention of the information. So all of that really doesn't make sense in early childhood, but starting middle and late childhood, that's when you start to see more of these kinds of assessments for people. We're going to talk a lot about different theories of intelligence. Again, because of that development, cognitive development, we can start exploring the beginnings of how people learn and maybe their learning styles, those kind of ideas. So there are many, many theories of intelligence, and yes, you need to know them. Okay, so remember, information processing theories really focus on things like memory and attention. It's that idea that people are almost like computers, right? We have the input, sensory input, using our senses, our eyes, our ears, our skin, all those things are taking in information from the outside world. And then we have our short-term memory. We want to try to take that sensory memory and short-term memory and put it into long-term memory. So a lot of information processing theories have to do with memory and attention. So let's get into this, right? In middle childhood, as I mentioned, kids now are much better at keeping their attention on one topic or on in school. They're better at that. Their working memory has improved, and they start to learn some memory strategies. However, sometimes it doesn't work so great, right? So there are three potential issues that happen with memory strategies. So a mediation deficiency is when they learn a strategy but don't really understand why it's useful. Okay, why is it good to repeat things? That kind of idea. Production deficiency is when kids know of a strategy, but they're not going to use it unless somebody tells them to use it. Okay, so if you want to learn somebody's phone number, repeat it 7 times, right? Or if you want to learn somebody's name, say their name 4 times in a sentence or in a conversation within the first 5 minutes of meeting them, and you learn their name. So these are little kind of strategies that people can use, but when somebody has a production deficiency, they don't know when to use them unless somebody tells them to do it. And then we have utilization deficiency, and that's they know sort of about a strategy, but don't really use it effectively. So at this stage, a lot of potential that's going on. Their knowledge base increases, and kids now are capable of critical thinking. So here is just a little graph of some research, cross-sectional research that happened. And what they were doing is they were trying to see if at what stage kids start to use memory strategies. So you could see at age 6, only about 55% of students use memory strategies. By the age of 10, right? Sorry, who did not use any memory strategy. So 55% did not use memory strategies at the age of 6. By the age of 10, vast majority use memory strategies. So it just keeps increasing how I think they learn. Also, as you go on in school, you need to use more memory strategies to keep in mind all that information, right? So majority of kids age 6 don't use memory strategies, and majority of kids by age 10 do use memory strategies. Okay, so in terms of memory, we do know that kids at this stage have much more increased speed and capacity in comparison to those in early childhood. So you can see the green line indicates the grade, right? So kindergarten all the way up to 6th grade. How much can they remember? So this is this is a study where kids are given a list of words, and they're not only asked to recall the words, but how quickly they can recall the words. So even just naming, recalling that list and naming it, the speed increases, not just how much they can remember, but how quickly they can recall it. So here are some major memory strategies, right? Rehearsal. So that one is just kind of repeating it over and over again. Organization, chunking, right? So grouping words or letters in a way that's meaningful. So NFL, SJ, BTW, CA, those are, if you had to memorize this list of NFL, SJ, BTW, CA, one strategy would to break it up into meaningful chunks. That way you can remember the order of them. And finally, there's elaboration. So elaboration is when you take a piece of information and you make it more personal to yourself to make it easier to remember. So this is why I really encourage, especially in this class, developmental psychology, is, for these, especially these early stages, you've been through them. And maybe it might be helpful. It's like, oh, I can remember, some history facts because when I was in middle childhood, we played pirates a lot or something like that. Anything that you can use to make it personal to yourself, that is the elaboration strategy. If you make it personal to yourself, it's actually easier to recall the information later. So this is just a cartoon where, he says, I don't see how you remember your locker combination, Charlie Brown. And then Charlie Brown's like, it's easy, 3, 24, 7. And Linus is like, how do you remember it? It's like, Babe Ruth was number 3, Willie Mays is number 24, and Mickey Mantle is number 7. So that is an example of an elaboration strategy where he took these numbers and made it meaningful to him. It's not his own experience, but he loves baseball. And so it was easy for him to remember that. Okay, so just as metacognition is the ability to think about how you learn, meta memory is the ability to consider how you remember things. That's what meta memory is, the ability to think about your own memory processes. This is a type of metacognition. So in terms of attention, kids are much better in terms of regulating their attention. They're good at those activities where it's like, find the difference between these two pictures, that kind of idea. So now we're past the primary ages. Now we're in like real school, right? So teachers now expect kids to stay focused. They're better at ignoring distractions. Remember the selective attention, and they're much better at systematic processing. So in terms of executive functioning, self-control is huge, right? Inhibition and impulse control improves. So in early childhood, that marshmallow test was wonderful to see how many kids can, delay eating that one marshmallow in order to get the 3 marshmallows later. Well, that's not a problem really for kids in middle and late childhood. It's really in early childhood where there's an issue. Just remember the 3 types of self-control. Remember, response initiation is your ability to delay an action. It's like, okay, you're really upset and you want to, scream at somebody and you don't even do that. Okay, that's the delayed action. Response inhibition is when you're already in the process of doing something and you're able to stop yourself. So it could be, okay, you get into a car accident, you're upset, and you stop yourself from going out and screaming at the person who hit you. Okay, that's response initiation. Response inhibition is if you're already outside and, yelling, and then you stop yourself. That's response inhibition. And then delayed gratification is your ability to wait for a reward. Education is a wonderful example of delayed gratification. You're taking these courses, you have an ed plan. What is your big picture? Well, you want to get your degree, right? So that is the reward that you are looking for as you go through this process of school. So you're delaying, your ability to go have more fun or go, work or anything that because the greater reward is school. That's an example of delayed gratification. Any questions so far? Okay, we're going to go into different intelligence theories. Okay, here we go. So first one is Spearman's general versus specific intelligences. So Spearman believed there were only 2 types of intelligence. He believed that there is something called the general intelligence factor, sort of things that we would generally understand as being part of intelligence. So someone's ability to learn, reason, adapt to things. So there are a lot of different tasks that can really measure if you have general intelligence. Specific intelligence, on the other hand, would be certain skills in narrow domains. So general intelligence, can you solve these problems, right? Just common sense problems. Specific intelligence might be, can you draw something very carefully, copy this piece of art, or even mathematical abilities can be considered a specific intelligence. Even being able to analyze certain information, those kind of things are specific intelligences. Building a bookcase is a type of skill that could be considered a specific intelligence. So Spearman really thought that there were different types generally of intelligence, and that if somebody had a lot of general intelligence, they would do well in school and have really good information processing speed. Not only know school facts, but even know things outside of school, right? So those are the kind of factors that he believed marked general intelligence. Herb and Cattell, on the other hand, believed in what is called crystallized and fluid intelligence. So Spearman, general and specific intelligence. Herb and Cattell called it crystallized and fluid intelligence, different types. Crystallized intelligence are things that are like facts. How many facts do you know, right? Factual knowledge. This is often what we learn in school, is crystallized, builds our crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence, on the other hand, is somebody's problem-solving ability. So think about that. So problem-solving ability, it's called fluid intelligence because it requires a level of adaptability, being able to take these different pieces of information and coming in at different times. Crystallized intelligence, on the other hand, are things that don't really change. It's, knowing that 1 + 1 = 2, knowing when the US Constitution was written up. Those kind of things would fall under crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence would be more like more hands-on kind of issues that you're dealing with. So we had Spearman, then we had Herb and Cattell. Now we have Gardner's multiple intelligences. So Howard Gardner said, no, we don't just have two types of intelligence. Actually, we have multiple intelligences. So he said there were 8 different types of intelligence. So spatial, logical, mathematical, linguistic. He argued that these are the types of intelligence that schools really focus on, but we don't encourage the other types of intelligence. So these are other types of intelligence: music, personal, bodily kinesthetic, and naturalistic. So all of these, in Gardner's theory, comprised intelligences in different realms, right? So here's a summary of the different types of intelligences that Gardner talked about. So linguistic, ability to speak and write well. Logical, mathematical, ability to use logic and mathematical skills, right? Math, doing well in math. Engineers would be really good at that. Spatial, ability to think and reason about objects in 3 dimensions. So being artists would be really good. Architects would have strong spatial abilities. Musical, ability to perform and enjoy music. Kinesthetic, the ability of to move the body in sports, dance, or other physical activities. So athletes would have really high kinesthetic intelligence. Interpersonal is the ability to understand and interact with others, and intrapersonal is the ability to have insight into yourself. So that is, a skill that many people don't have. And then finally, naturalistic is the ability to recognize, identify, and understand animals, plants, and other living things. So biologist would be good at naturalistic, and maybe a veterinarian, things like that. So these are his 8 specific intelligences. So we had Spearman, who said general and specific intelligence. We had Herb and Cattell, who said crystallized and fluid intelligence. And then Gardner said there were 8 intelligences. Well, Sternberg kind of went, 8 is too many, 2 is too few. So in his idea, there are 3 types of intelligence. There's analytic, practical, and creative. And so he called this his triarchic theory of intelligence. So analytical intelligence is your ability to solve problems and calculations, more an academic sort of idea. Creative, on the other hand, that's your ability to adapt to new situations and create new ideas. So creative intelligence, obviously artists would be very good in that. And with creative intelligence, what we're looking for is divergent thinking. So divergent thinking is being your ability to come up with many different ways to approach a problem. One way that we test divergent thinking is we'll maybe give somebody a paperclip and say, how many different things can you do with a paperclip? Write it down. And then we just see how many different ways somebody can use a paperclip. That is a very easy test of divergent thinking. And then so we had analytical intelligence, creative intelligence, and finally practical intelligence. And that is sort of, common sense. So analytic intelligence would be more like what you learn in school. Creative intelligence would be things more artistic, and then practical intelligence would be common sense. So another component to keep in mind, and we talk about this in the textbook, is that creativity really has multiple dimensions. Just like intelligence has multiple aspects to it, so does creativity. So in order to consider somebody creative, right, these are the types of characteristics they might have. They would have expertise. So creative people usually are really passionate and they learn a lot about a topic. Imaginative thinking. Creative people view problems in new and different ways. Risk-taking. Creative people tend to be eager or more willing to take risky approaches as opposed to people who are not creative. Intrinsic interest. So creative people are usually pursuing their projects just because they love it, because of passion, not because they're being paid to do it. And finally, creative people like to work in creative environments. So the most creative people are supported, aided, and challenged by people working on similar projects. Questions so far? Okay, Carol Dweck and intelligence mindsets. So Carol Dweck has a different kind of approach to thinking about intelligence. And what she says is that the way you think about intelligence will have an effect on you, right? So a fixed mindset, if somebody has a fixed mindset, it means they think they're pretty much born with all the intelligence they will ever have, and they can't do anything to improve their skills or knowledge. It's like, okay, I don't have the math gene, so I'm not going to take any math classes. If you hear somebody say that, that means they have a fixed mindset. On the other hand, there is a growth mindset. So when somebody has a growth mindset, they believe that you can learn anything you want. You just have to apply yourself and put more effort. And what research, she's done a lot of research on these intelligence mindsets, and she's found that people with the growth mindset are much more resilient. They're more likely to try new things because they believe they're not afraid of making mistakes, right? When you have a growth mindset, you're eager to try new things because trying these new experiences actually improves. You only learn by doing, right? So when you have a growth mindset, you believe that if you make mistakes, you can learn from them. If you have a fixed mindset, then making mistakes, you're afraid to make mistakes because you think it's going to show that you're dumb or something like that. So people with growth mindsets tend to be much more willing and flexible to try new things as opposed to fixed mindsets. And a lot of times we get our mindsets from our parents. So if, you didn't do so well on a test and your parent was like, oh my gosh, why are you so dumb or something like that, then that shows they have a fixed mindset. On the other hand, if your parents was like, okay, you didn't do so well, let's take a look at, how you were thinking about this and let's practice some more. And so when effort becomes the focus rather than the outcome, that's how you know that there's a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. Okay, so when it comes to intelligence, a lot of times there's that whole nature versus nurture idea, right? On one side, sometimes people will say intelligence is innate, it's not influenced by the environment, right? It's purely genetic. On the other hand, there are people who say intelligence is influenced by experiences. And the truth is that it is a combination, right? There is a genetic component to intelligence, definitely, but experiences, opportunities also plays a role. So there's something called the reaction range. Genetics will determine your reaction range. How high and how low you are in that range depends on the environment, right? So for an example, if somebody has, parents who are both 6'4" or 6'7", and then you have another person whose parents, are 5', 5'2", the reaction range in terms of height for the child of the parents who are, over 6 feet is going to be probably more like, 5'8" to 6'7" or something like that, meaning that's a range of height. And then you have the reaction range of the child who, whose parents are shorter. So their range in height is probably going to be more like 5 feet to 5'8" rather than up to 6'7". But it's their nutrition, it's how much they're sleeping, how much activity they have. All of that will play a role into where they fall in that reaction range. So if the person whose parents are both 6 feet tall doesn't sleep, doesn't get a lot of sleep, and doesn't eat well, then they could end up being a maximum height of 5'8". Whereas the person whose parents were, 5 feet, 5'2", they eat well, they get lots of protein, they're sleeping well. They could actually end up taller than the person whose parents were both 6 feet tall. And that's where that whole interaction between nature versus nurture comes in. And it is important to have that understanding. So school, school is actually introduced to help kids learn more and also like prepare them for working outside, right? It's a place where parents could put their kids safely. They know their kids are safe, hopefully. And they're learning these skills, they're learning, a knowledge base that will help them function as adults when they get older. What we do see is that there are differences in IQ, and we'll talk about what IQ means across grade levels. It kind of makes sense. Knowledge base increases, IQ increases. What we do find is that during the academic year, people's IQs increase, but then when you have that break, the 2-month break, the knowledge base, if it wasn't in long-term knowledge, it's going to go away. And so average IQs actually drop during the summer if kids aren't doing anything. So IQ is one measure of intelligence, right? There are a number of measures of intelligence. What needs to be consistent is that the test must be reliable, so showing consistency over time. They need to be valid. We need to feel like they're actually measuring intelligence, not something else. And standardization became really a big deal because we're trying to get a sense of how much knowledge and skill kids are learning on average at different age groups. Is there a problem with standardized test scores? Tests? Absolutely. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then we have something called the Flynn effect, where people start to do better on intelligence tests because of, better nutrition, education. So what they do is they actually reset the average IQ to be 100. So even if it's like starts to inch up, it gets reset to 100 because it's all relative in terms of what other people are learning at the same time period. So when we did the first intelligence tests were actually developed in the 1900s by Binet and Simon. And they were really looking for abnormal development, kids who might need more support in school. So the idea when we talk about intelligence tests, it's got to be based on observable behavior, right? Again, when we talk about psychology, we're talking about concepts that aren't, really easy to see because it's in somebody's brain. So when we talk about testing, it has to be something specific, observable, and measurable. So in early and middle childhood, a lot of testing starts to happen in schools. So the Wechsler Intelligence Test is also known as the WISC. It's the most widely used instrument for kids 6 years and older. It tests for things like general knowledge of the world. And it's important also to note that language plays a big role. So kids who are learning English as a second language are going to be at a disadvantage, and that has to be taken into account when they take these sorts of tests. So now they do offer tests in different languages as well. So typical questions, what does simple mean? Or what, show a picture, what is this? Or maybe an explanation, how are anger and delight similar? Those kind of ideas. Also, you have the performance section. So you have the verbal section, right, of the test, and then you have a performance section. So in many ways, this kind of goes with Gardner's idea of different intelligences. So the WISC takes it into account that it's not just those general knowledge that's important, but also, spatially and visually, what can they do? How can they assess situations? So here, how many carrots? So it's not only the right answer, it's how quickly they're solving these answers as well. And then they give them blocks and have them arrange it into different patterns. So that's the WISC. And oftentimes it's used to determine if someone can go into different classes, maybe gifted and talented class, education class, or maybe need an extra support class. Those are reasons why schools might have kids take the WISC. The most popular, so even though the WISC is the one most used in school, the intelligence test or IQ score is the one people are very familiar with, right? It's called intelligence quotient because there's actually a division. Like we call quotient is the answer to a division problem. Well, in the intelligence quotient, you're dividing your mental age by your chronological age. For example, if somebody's 14 years old, mentally, this is based on their knowledge and things they can do, but chronologically are 12 years old, you take mental age of 14, divide by 12, then they have an IQ of 125. If you have a mental age that is consistent with your chronological age, your IQ is going to be 100, and that's what we have as the average IQ score. Now, on the other hand, what if you have somebody who has a mental age of 10, so much younger in their thinking, and the chronological age of 12, then their IQ will be below 100. So 10 divided by 12, and that equals 86. So make sure you do know how to calculate an IQ score. So this picture here kind of shows the spread, how it works in here. This is the general population in terms of IQ. So as you know, the 100 is right in the middle. That is the average IQ score. And then this is what we call the normal curve. So what this says is 68% of adults will fall within one standard deviation of the IQ of 100. That means 68% of the population will have anywhere between an 85 and 115 IQ score. That's what it means. So then you look at the orange part and you add 14% each. And so what this is saying now is that you have 95% of adults fall within an IQ of 70 or 130. And then you have about 99% of adults have an IQ of greater than 55 and lower than 145. So this is kind of the spread of IQ that we have. So when you get really frustrated with people, just keep in mind that 50% of the population roughly have an IQ of less than 100. So be patient, right? Even though we know the IQ score, the testing is flawed, it's culturally biased, we do find in research that it is predictive. It can predict academic, economic, and occupational success. In fact, it's more closely related to occupational success than socioeconomic status. So there is a predictive component to it. What do we know is that usually people's IQ scores are pretty stable from 5 years old on. Remember, it's based on your age. And so the test for somebody who's 5 years old is going to be different than a test for someone who's 10, 20, 30, that kind of idea. So usually when we look at infants, what we're looking for is looking to identify developmental problems, not intelligence. And this is, should have had this with the other slide that showed the distribution of scores. And this shows that idea of the Flynn effect is how over time, the IQ average actually goes up, and so we always have to readjust. This also shows different ways that different countries are performing on the IQ test. So are IQ tests culturally biased? Yes, they are culturally biased. Different cultures define intelligence differently. I do not know how other countries look at intelligence tests. I think that would be a really good research question for somebody to explore. So in terms of extremes of intelligence, right, we said the average IQ score is 100. If somebody has an intellectual disability, they are falling, below 2 standard deviations of the mean. And it could really affect their ability to live their lives. And so sometimes it could be genetic or environmental factors that cause that. Now, on the other hand, other extreme, if someone has an IQ of 130 or higher, they're considered gifted. It is associated with good professional and social outcomes. And the question, though, is how do we address that in educational settings? A lot of times we're looking at support for people who are not doing so well, but we are kind of missing out on enhancing the experience of those who have exceptional IQs. So what do we know in terms of education? Parents are still very important at this stage. It's not as easy for parents, right? There's work transportation issues. Teachers sometimes have a bias towards certain parents, who's more similar to them. And parents who have what we call family capital also have an advantage for their children. Their ability to connect with teachers, maybe even just higher education, all those things play a role and start to actually result with different, the inequities that we see in school now. We also know that cultural differences can affect classroom behavior and performance. And so that's also important for educators to understand. So I'm going to stop sharing. We're at 10:36, and I will actually do another recording for the socio-emotional status for middle and late childhood.